Welcome to the Deep Leadership Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Peter Desberg and Jeffrey Davis. Peter is a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in the area of stage fright and performance anxiety. Jeffrey is a successful writer-producer in Hollywood and a professor of film and TV writing at Loyola Marymount University. They are the authors of a new book called Pitch Like Hollywood. What can you learn from the high-stakes film industry? This book helps leaders become more persuasive in their presentations by incorporating elements of the classic Hollywood pitch, driving emotion, piquing interest, piquing curiosity, and ultimately winning over their audiences. Persuasion and influence is a big part of leadership, so I'm excited to have them on the show to talk about this topic. So, Peter and Jeffrey, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for having us.
I'm excited about this. This is really interesting. It's completely kind of off the normal topics we cover on this leadership show, but it's really critical and really important. As I mentioned, persuasion, influence are a big part of leadership. So the thing I wanted to talk to you about really just, to start us off, tell us a little bit about your different backgrounds and then how you came together to write this book.
Peter?
Well, my background is actually as a research psychologist. And then later I went back and got a clinical psych license because I wanted to be able to work with folks about the stuff that I learned. And I'd like to say I've been a boring university professor most of my life, but that's redundant. But if you want a little story, I taught a course for a while called Instructional Humor. And it was a course for public speakers, how to use humor to get their points across. And the thing that I found most interesting is everything was fine. We had fun each session until the end where they had to do stuff. And that's where I got to realize that the number one fear in America really was fear of public speaking.
Yes.
And Jerry Seinfeld has a great line. He says, fear of dying is number 5. He says, know that the next time you're at a funeral, most people would rather be in the coffin than delivering the eulogy.
Yes, it's so true.
And so I got really interested in watching how scared people got and ways to get over it. And just the one little thing I'll say is that if we get a chance to talk about stage fright today, that it's not a haves and have-nots, like some people get it, some don't. It's situational. Everybody under the right circumstances will have it.
I agree. Yeah, that's a good point.
If I can throw in one more little story that shows this point nicely, and I promise to be quiet. But I was very fortunate years ago to interview a man named Paul Solomonovich, who was the music director and conductor of the LA Master Chorale. And he told me that I went to Rome and I did a performance with my choir at the Vatican in front of 5,000 people, the entire College of Cardinals and the Pope. And it was great, hand steady, never felt a lick of fear. A month later, I went to Atlanta with the same choir doing the same program at the American Choral Conductors Conference. And my hand was shaking like a leaf. I could hardly hold on to my baton.
Yes.
I mean, you can see how situational it is. The Pope was never going to say, hey, on measure 52, you missed the downbeat. But those choral conductors, it would be a scandal.
Yes, you're presenting in front of your peers is it's very challenging. I've done it before, so I know exactly why that situation would be more nerve-wracking. Absolutely.
Well, Jeffrey has a much more interesting background than I do.
I'm third generation show business. My great uncle, who I never met, was a film composer. My dad and my stepdad were writer producers, and I had a stepmother who was part of the MGM. I guess that the golden age period, and made a lot of Bob Hope movies, things like that. So I do come from that. So I guess I'm not one of those people that got off the bus with starry eyes and show business, because I saw both sides of it. I got interested in this project when Peter brought it to me in its nascent stages, because I'm someone who, well, first of all, I don't think that stage fright and persuasion are talked about enough in books about pitching. And Peter's an expert on both. And I'm one of those people who suffered greatly from fear for years. And so this is the kind of book that I thought I would like to read. So why not be part of writing it? So that's my story, and I'm going to stick to it because
I love it, and I think it's great. And I've got a copy of the book for those people watching on YouTube. It's called Pitch Like Hollywood, and it's very bright and colorful. You can't miss it when it's on the shelf.
One of the interesting things about how the book came about was Jeffrey and I have done a couple of books where we interviewed well-known Hollywood comedy writers, asking them how they do what they do. And we're enormously proud of the book because we didn't do very much work on it. We, instead of saying, tell us how you write, we actually had them write in real time while we watched. And as we were interviewing them, they all kept telling us stories about pitching. And so when we first started writing the book, it was going to be a book on how do you pitch in Hollywood. And then one of the things that we noticed, we were reading the Harvard Business Review, and it shows you what boring lies we lead. And we came across an article by a couple of organizational psychologists, that's a nice way of saying business psychologists, who said, we're going to do the biggest study ever done on pitching. And we're going to go to the lion's den, the hardest place there is to pitch, Hollywood. And Jeffrey and I both looked at each other and said, why are we going to limit this to Hollywood? These principles are everywhere. They're omnipresent.
Yeah, they really are. Yeah. And that's why you guys are here on the show, because I think it's an important part of leadership, especially as an entrepreneur. You're pitching all day long. You know, you're pitching to customers, investors, your own employees. It's all about influence and persuasion. So yeah, I think that if we can master the skills that come along with pitching a Hollywood movie or a show, then I think we can be very effective in our leadership roles as either in a small business or in a larger organization. So absolutely. So my question is, like, explain what a Hollywood pitch is, because I think I know what it is, but I only know it from what I might see on TV or you might see in the movies or a show. So what is a Hollywood pitch?
Well, I'll try to break that down, and then I'll have Peter come in and do the other half of it. So the Hollywood pitch is based on storytelling, which, you know, Peter and I have done our share of business presentations, and we've gone to retreats and spoken, and we've seen other people speak, and it's all, you know, it's something's on a screen, people are looking at, they're not telling a story. So it starts with storytelling. And then the most important element in any story is conflict. So we decided that, and Peter does this wonderful thing in the book where we use the Odd Couple, the great Odd Couple, as an example of a pitch. And we start with a hook and then a log line. You probably saw this in the book. And then we do a 3-act structure. And then Peter created the same, adapted that to a pitch about a food app. And so we think it's universal. But the thing that it has to have is character, conflict, a 3-act structure, just enough so that the buyer, person listening, wants to know more. And that's the thing that we think is missing from most business pitches, that they're not telling you. And also the other element to me, and then I'll let Peter take over, is what people come in and try to sell. And selling is the last thing you want to do, because selling is being talked at. Nobody wants to be talked at. What was that thing you just made? No, like a no sign, right? You want to start. We think that part of the Hollywood pitch is you're there to start a conversation. and most of the people, we talk to people across businesses, across industries, and they all said the same thing. I want to start a conversation and I want to know why now. That's not really selling.
Yeah.
And Peter will give you some more details about that 3-act structure.
Well, before I get to the 3-act structure, in case people are having trouble going back to sleep this morning, I'll be an academic for a moment and say that one of the things that actually drives all of this is there's abundant evidence that storytelling is an intrinsic human function, and that if you want, the main thing when you're talking to people is you want to be remembered. You want to be memorable in what you do, and people remember stories way better than facts, way better than details. And so putting things in a story context, excellent for that. I was working with a guy, he was a recent Stanford graduate, was on the fast track in investment banking. And he said, I get terrified every week because every week my bank gives me a new company to assess. And then I go in front of the board and I have to present the information to see if they want to invest in it. And I look at a sea of glazed over eyes, listening to this parade of numbers. And it's horrible to go through. And so we said, all right, let's play with 3-act structure here. So in the first act, it's where you explain the world you're in. Here's what's really happening. Here's the big picture. Here's the overview. When Jeffrey mentioned before, hooks and log lines are the biggest picture you can have. Because again, you want to always be oriented. You want to have an idea of where are we? You don't want to jump in with facts, which is what this poor fellow was doing. And so in the first act, you lay out, here's this business, here's what it does, but here are the people involved, here are the issues. Act 2 is where you really generate the heart-pounding interest by stressing what Jeffrey was talking about, the conflict. So any problem that this business was having, any outstanding issues that they need to be aware of, that's where they hit them. Act 2, you present all of that. Act 3 is your resolution. Now, the real good Hollywood pitch holds back the ending, and what they're hoping for is that the audience will say, well, what happened next? Because that's what you really want. But in a business pitch, you got to end it. You got to tell them where it's going. But this is where you resolve everything. And the first thing that he discovered was, he came back to me after the first or second time he tried this and said, it's amazing. I cut out half the numbers. Because I was just giving him a sea of numbers because they expected that. But now my criterion for including a number was, does it drive the narrative? Does it explain what the issues are that they're interested in? And by giving them fewer numbers, they were able to focus in on the key ones to help them make the decision.
Yeah, I love it.
He was really stunned. And he said the biggest compliment he got was all of his peers started using the same structure.
I love it. No, that's great. That's so essentially what the 3 acts are is creating the story. Like you said, stories are more memorable for us. So the story pulls the listener along through this. Here's the current state, here's the conflict, and here's the resolution or the potential resolution in the case of trying to hold that tension, right? And keep that tension. And so you lay out a way that we can bring stories into our pitches and our presentations through these 3 acts, which is really interesting. Yeah,
you laid that out really nicely. And when you hear Jeffrey talk about it, because this is what he does. He teaches screenwriting. The two C words are the ones you hear all the time: character and conflict. Character important because if you don't care, who cares how the conflict turns out?
Yes.
And so again, in Act 1, as you're setting the stage, that's where you're revealing whether it's the character of the company, the people involved, you want some sort of buy-in, like I care about what happens here. So then the conflict interests me, and then I want to see how it's going to be taken care of.
Right.
I like this. To be honest with you, I mean, I've been in business for 30 years and you don't see this, right? You don't see this in a typical pitch or a typical, when you're trying to convince somebody or get somebody on your team, you don't see that. You typically don't see somebody pitching a storyline like this. So you'll see, numbers, like you mentioned, a lot of numbers, a lot of details, but what's the story and where are we in the story and where do you want me, the listener, in that story? Which I think that's something we can learn from the way you have to pitch in Hollywood. But my question, Mike, well, go ahead. Sorry.
No, please.
No, I was going to say, help us with the hook and the log lines, because I think that's kind of, I think we might understand hook, but when it comes to a Hollywood pitch, what's a hook and a log line? What does that look like?
Let's go back to The Odd Couple, which is probably the most famous comedy of the 20th American comedy of the 20th century. Everybody steals it. So, it's the hook is usually one line, 1.5 line that gets you interested. So the hook in that story might be the neatest man in the world moves in with his best friend, who is the sloppiest man in the world. They have all the same problems they had with their ex-wives and drive each other crazy. That's a hook. That makes me want to know more. Or actually the better one, because that's more of a log line now that I think about it, because that gives you more story. The hook would be the one that Peter came up with. I don't think Neil Simon thought of this, but the hook is saving your best friend's life. What's the line?
Saving your best friend's life can kill you.
Right. That would be the hook. I had it backward. Sorry about that. So the log line is a little more expanded, and that would be the first one that I pitched to you.
By the way, to give you a little of Jeffrey's lineage, his father was the showrunner for that series on TV.
Wow. I grew up watching that, so that's really wild. Yeah.
Well,
you'd be a little bit upset with me today that I got the log line up, but you get the point. So
yeah,
again, it's getting that big picture view, so that you get a sense of where everybody's going.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And
can I just throw in one little thing?
Yeah.
You talked about, we talked about what we see a lot in business pitches, particularly. And people are always concerned about, they ask the D question, do you have a good deck? And, you're going to see a PowerPoint presentation.
Yes.
And so permit me to be a cognitive scientist for a minute. One of the things that we're very big on is when you're talking to people, don't do anything but talk to them. And the worst thing you can do, I've seen people literally start out a pitch by giving out the business plan. One of the things, Jeffrey and I have some wonderful demonstrations that show that if I flash some text on a screen, you're going to read it, whether you intend to or not. You can't. We do one where literally we have a blank screen. We say, look at this rectangle. I'm going to flash words in it. Don't read them. Of course, by the third word, everybody's cracking up because you can't not read them.
Yeah.
Well, we also talk a lot about multitasking, which is something that humans are not wired to do. We have some great examples. If anybody is a doubter, we're not wired for multitasking. Well, the problem is, if I'm giving my pitch and I've got a bunch of bullet points on a screen, first of all, they're going to look at them.
Yep.
So already, if I've got two choices, I can consolidate the message by reading my bullet points. That's instant death, and I'll tell you why in a sec. Or I'm saying one thing and the bullet points are saying something else, and they're getting part of each message, but not the whole thing of either.
Yeah.
Now, just let me throw out a couple of boring facts, because if people are too stimulated, facts will always bring them down. The average college educated person reads approximately 250 words per minute. Our average speech, about 125 words a minute. If you're good at math, you read twice as fast as you listen. So if I'm reading bullet points, people are standing there drumming their fingers saying, why is he talking in slow motion? I'm already on the third bullet
Wow.
point. He's
Yeah.
still reading the first. It's making me crazy. Never
Well,
do
that's a nugget right there, for our listeners. People, you're reading twice as fast as you're hearing the presenter. So
that.
that's why people get frustrated when you're
Never
like, I
read
got the point already. I saw the slide.
the,
Yeah.
the rule we use is, if you're going to use PowerPoint, which is a great tool, use it for what you can't say. Use it for graphics,
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
because you can't say pictures, and pictures tell lots of words.
Mhm.
But use it for that. Don't use it to duplicate what you do, because words just sit there. But when you talk, you've got pitch, you've got loudness,
Yeah,
you've got all
yeah.
of these vocal qualities that any good speaker uses. And those words just sit there with a circle in front of them.
If,
Yeah.
you know,
Terrible.
there's another aspect to this off of what Peter's giving you, is one of the people we interviewed, who is a very old friend of mine, a producer named Nicole Fox, who absolutely, she talks in the book about how much she hates iPads in a pitch, and it's a corollary to what Peter's talking about. She's like, it prevents me from having a conversation with you. I'm focused. I don't know who you are. And the truth is, nobody is going to buy anything from somebody who they don't feel comfortable and safe around and get
Yeah.
to know.
Yeah.
So I think that's another thing that bullet points and presentations do. Peter taught me this years ago, that we went to a conference and there was somebody who was reading with the piece of paper, which had exactly the same thing on it that was up on the on the PowerPoint, and his face was covered. And he said, the one thing that you never ever say in any pitch or presentation, don't look at me, is basically what he was saying. He said, I'm nervous.
Yeah.
This is the thing I learned early on when I was pitching very badly, because I'm a believer, not everybody agrees with me, but I'm a believer that you don't learn as much from doing something right as from your mistakes.
Yes.
I think, I'm sure, having been in the service, you know that well, right?
Oh yeah, we've talked about it on the show a lot, and yeah, mistakes are great teaching tools. Yes.
And so you're calling attention to yourself. Believe me, most people know that pitching is, not a natural, it can be uncomfortable, but if you engage other people, then you take the attention off yourself and you make it like as if you were at a party, as if you were, that's how I've learned to do it over the years.
Let me add a point here that, Jeffrey keeps stressing rightfully that a good pitch is a conversation.
Yeah.
We had a great story. I was interviewing the head of an advertising company, an ad agency called the Designery. They have the Audi account, they have the Nissan account. They're doing quite well. And she told me a story about when she was just starting out, and she went out on a pitch with her art director, and the art director said, "We've got 6 different ad campaigns here. What do you think?"
Oh.
And the guy looked at him and said, "I hate every one of them."
Mhm.
And she's thinking, that's it, we're done, it's over. And this guy kind of smiled and looked at the fellow and said, "Tell me which one you hate the least."
That's
And that
great.
opened up a conversation
Yes. Yeah.
about what they were really looking for, how
Yeah.
they wanted to be presented, and they made the sale.
You say this in the book, and I think it's really important, is you start selling at no.
Yeah.
Yes.
And again, it's selling is such an odious thing that when
Yeah.
all else fails, that's when you start selling.
When it starts at no. And then you also say in the book, and I love this because I learned this early in my career, is when they say yes, you shut up.
Right.
Stop
Exactly.
pitching when you get to yes.
I was in a meeting. I'm telling you, I was in a meeting the other day, and everybody in the meeting said, yes, that's a great idea. And the person just kept
Yeah,
talking.
I've seen
And
it.
it was a really important meeting, and everyone else had somewhere to be. That's the other thing that I think we try to talk about in the book. Producer manager Peter Heller talks about having empathy for the buyer.
Yeah.
And I think that isn't considered enough in either leadership or in sales, in pitching. You know, they're people too. Their time is valuable. This thing that happened to me yesterday, we were all, even if we weren't wearing watches, we were looking at our pretend watches or our computers, and because it was on Zoom, and we were all thinking, you got a yes 15 minutes ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you were still telling us why we should do this. I don't want to do it anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Then you start.
That's
Yeah.
the danger, overselling, right?
In academia, we dread meetings.
Yeah.
And I had a boss years ago that from the first meeting, he said, okay, nobody sit. We stand during the entire meeting.
Hmm.
Peter
we
told
do
me-
that.
It over so
Yeah.
quickly. And if
Yeah.
anybody dared to ramble, he
That's
got
it.
close.
That's it. You see everybody.
I was chair for 10 years at in the screenwriting department, and I used to complain frequently to Peter about how long these meetings went on because people had to say the same thing 4 or 5 times. He said, "Take the table and chairs out of the room."
Yeah. Yeah. We do a stand-up meeting in my I run a manufacturing company. We do a stand-up meeting every morning, and it's
Yeah.
5-10 minutes because we don't like nobody likes standing. So we get it done quick and we go on with the day. So it makes sense.
When we first started chatting, you said that you wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about persuasion.
Yes, that's the next topic. So
I'm going to
talk.
persuade you to talk about that for a minute.
Yeah. So what do we need to know as leaders, as we're pitching, as we're trying to convince people? What do we need to know about the art of persuasion?
I would say chapter 5, 6, and 7.
Yes, I know.
Let me stretch that out a little bit.
Which, by the way, we don't have yet. You have it.
Wait, you don't have a copy of the book and I do?
Exactly. So one of the first things to understand is that persuasion generally happens below the level of awareness. As you're being persuaded, you don't realize it's happening unto you. One of my favorite studies that we talk about in the book, college students were divided into 2 groups. They gave each group a bunch of words and said, take these words and fashion them into different sentences. Just make different sentences out of them, sort of a jumble game. Unbeknownst to them, one group had words that indicated youth and the other old age. You know, there were subtle words like wrinkle and gray and yellow and fast. And then they said, okay, now you've spent 15 minutes making these sentences. The next part of the study is down at the end of this long corridor in that office over to the left. What they didn't know is the real experiment was they timed them to see how fast they'd walk. And the group that had the youth words were way faster than the group that had the old words. They didn't say a word. That this phenomenon is called priming, and just playing with those words changed their behavior afterwards. And when they asked them later, are you aware that? No, not even a clue. So much of this stuff happens underneath the level of awareness. Now, if I can very quickly plug another book, which is the best book I've probably ever read. There's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman, Princeton professor and Nobel Prize winner in economics. Brilliant, brilliant book. And without telling you what's in this 350-page book, he talks about one very interesting thing. He says, people don't like to think really hard, but they have the fantasy that they do.
Mm.
So when you ask them, I just gave you this difficult, important situation in your life. Did you really think it through, or did you just kind of use your intuition? They all say, no, I thought it through. And then he demonstrates why they did not, and they used their intuition. Now, intuition sounds like a flighty term, but it encompasses everything you know, everything you believe in, every bias that you have. Very powerful thing. And it enables you to get through the day. Well, you would also mention in one of your questions to us, why is preparation so important?
Yeah.
And the reason is the more you know about the person you're pitching to, the better you can present it to him in terms that will hit him intuitively. Because the minute you make somebody go into deep thought, they don't like it, which means they don't like you as the agent that made them do it. But worse than that is because it doesn't fit into their worldview easily, they're now way more skeptical.
Yes.
The last place you want to get somebody when you're trying to persuade them to go your way.
Yes. You guys both mentioned it earlier, was empathy to the listener. What, and part of empathy is knowing your audience, right? Who am I pitching to?
Exactly.
Who am I trying to convince? And then if it's one person, you better know a lot about that person, right? And what their tendencies are. And because you want to make sure to address it in the way that that convince them, more likely to convince them.
Let me tell you a quick story, if I may. We interviewed the number 2 guy at Boeing.
Wow.
And he told us a great story that a woman came in and said, we want Boeing to be part of this project. We want to have a competition for the first person to be able to do a standalone flying machine. And Boeing said, well, this looks great for us to be, looking at this forward-looking thing, comma, but. And you can see where the blood comes in, or what they land on if it doesn't work well. So somebody could die doing this. He said, this woman was so brilliant. She was an attorney and talked about how they can fix the liability so it never attaches to Boeing. They said, we'd like you guys to be in on the first part of this, which is looking at development, which is what you do. Then we'll move you out when it comes to the testing of it, so that none of this will be associated with you. So she was immediately saying, I'm putting myself in your place, and I'm making sure that nowhere will the bad stuff attach to you. She was totally empathic and understood where they would balk and why it wouldn't work for them, and pitched it showing that she understood that.
Yeah.
He said he was completely taken aback and charmed.
Yeah.
I think that what you asked the question about, so your question also implied preparation. So obviously she knew who she was pitching to, and she knew what the stakes were. I would tell, there's a story that is also in the book. It's Toyota, and I'll give you the short version. A guy came in to see the top executives at Toyota, who we also interviewed, and had a briefcase. He was in flip-flops and cutoffs, and he had a briefcase, and he said that inside the briefcase, he had a solution to making it possible for the cars, for Toyota cars, to get better gas mileage. He never opened the briefcase. They're all thinking we're spending billions of dollars a year to try to do this very same thing. And the guy never tells us how. He never actually made the pitch. He didn't do his homework, didn't know anything about the people. And that's the dark side of what can happen to you when you come in. I also would say that there's a very famous writer in Hollywood named Larry Kasdan, who wrote one of the early Star Wars movies and has written a lot of other movies. And he said, being a writer, and I think this applies to everybody, he said, being a writer is having homework for the rest of your life.
I saw that in the book.
It's great, isn't it? And
yeah.
And so if you're, Peter's favorite illustration of this, but I'll tell it, is, if you're going in to pitch a Western and you don't do your homework and find out that the guy hates Westerns,
Yes.
you're dead on arrival. There's no hope. And really, I think what's happened to me when I've been pitched to is a lot of people haven't done their research. They don't know the kinds of stories that would interest me. I tell my students that's as important as the project you're pitching, because they may say, we don't want to do this project, or we're doing something like it. You want them to like you so that they might call you back. The whole thing, that goes back to the conversation again, I think, John.
Yeah, I really do.
And Jeffrey is talking about something really interesting here. That,
really? Am I?
well, first time for everything. That every pitch has two intentions. One is obviously the project that you're pitching, but the other is getting them to say to themselves, this is somebody I'd like to work with. This is somebody I'd like to be in business with. And Jeffrey can tell you legion stories where somebody comes in with a screenplay, they don't buy it. 3 weeks later, there's a phone call. Hey, we just got a novel. We want adapted to a screenplay. We like your writing. Come on in.
Yeah. Yeah. So
and it was as much because of the way they got along as just their talent.
So you're selling yourself as well.
Exactly.
And you're not just selling the project, you're selling yourself.
And again, the way you see this is, how do you take feedback?
Yeah.
Do you get defensive, or do you look thankful that you're getting something at all? It's interesting that people who aren't very good at pitching, and this is particularly rampant in Hollywood, get enormously defensive, and you get the attitude of, wait a minute, I'm the writer, you're just a producer, you don't know how to write, you're telling me what to do. And that's a great way to be ushered out of a room.
Yeah.
And what you're always looking for is, let me have it, give me more. And what you're really doing is fostering a creative collaboration.
Yes.
Right.
And the irony is, half the time they don't even remember what they told you at the time. And you don't even have to do it, but it doesn't matter. You want them to do it. And in the book, we actually give some techniques so that if they're not coming out with ideas for you, how you can get some ideas pulled out of them, how you can encourage them to do it.
This is because I don't want to leave today without addressing leadership, because I think having had some of and it's a leadership podcast.
Yes.
And I think I've had some of the worst bosses in history. And as Peter says, you can learn more sometimes from what's a bad boss as you can from what's a good boss. So I've had everybody from screamers to people who throw iPhones and kick over coffee tables. I had one boss say to me, I know I asked you for your opinion, but I didn't really think you'd give it to me. So I think what makes great leadership, and I try to emulate it when I was chair and when I produced, I was lucky to have great mentors, is listening, collaborating, and maybe most of all, being inclusive and not thinking you have, I had one boss who really just wanted our approbation, our approval, and really wasn't interested in our opinions at all. And I think that that's not good leadership. Good leadership is like when you're a new leader and you come into any corporate culture and try to change it right away, that's a big mistake. And so we learned that a lot in research. There's a lot that, unfortunately, because the book had a certain page count, we couldn't get into the book. There's a lot more about leadership that didn't get in. There's some about leadership in the book, but not as much as we would have liked, because we didn't have.
Since Jeffrey's opened this door, let me just tell you two quick studies that I think are interesting in terms of leadership. One was an education study where they looked at what makes students like teachers, who I think are supposed to be leaders. And it's one of those things where there's an old joke about why certain people have round shoulders and flat foreheads. You ask them a question, you tell them the answer. I hope they could see that, otherwise it didn't make much sense. But the single variable that made students like their teachers is feeling that their teachers cared about them. That one thing trumped everything else. How clear they were, how funny they were, nothing else even came close. But the other one is a much more boring study because I did it. And so it was a chance to tout my own research, but it's one you may not have run across, where we had employees rate their supervisors on their sense of humor. And the first thing we found out was that your assessment of humor correlates with everything that's good. If you're rated high on humor, you're rated high on intelligence, on creativity, nice, everything. But the part of the study we found really interesting was then we said, okay, within humor, there's two basic types. There's hostile humor, and there's more supportive humor. And what we found, and I think this is really critical in leadership and not talked about nearly enough, is I think one of the most important traits for a leader to have is being approachable. Because if somebody's scared to come to you, terrible things can happen and you don't find out till way too late.
Right.
And people who had a hostile sense of humor, hey, nice tie, did you mop up your coffee with it, are not as approachable. And people who are more likely to make self-effacing jokes and kinder jokes are much more approachable. And people will come up to them and when things are tough and know they can talk to this person more easily.
Wow, that's a nugget I didn't know was going to come out of this podcast. This
That's
episode,
why we
and
have these talks.
I love it. The idea of humor, and I talk about humor. Humor was a big part of our life under the ocean because, well, we faced a lot of adversity. So humor was a way to get through the day. And humor is a big part of leadership. And I'm glad to hear that the studies back up what I've noticed over my career is that the people who, like you said, are they're more approachable when they seem to have a sense of humor and especially when they take light of themselves. I always say, take your job seriously, but not yourself. And I think that's a big part of
nicely said.
Being a great leader. Yeah.
Very definitely. Well said.
Yeah. I didn't expect that nugget when we went down into this book, but listen, we're wrapping up for the day. This is we have just, for the listeners on the show, we have just scratched the surface. This is an amazing book. Again, I'll hold it up for those on YouTube. It's called Pitch Like Hollywood. And when does it come out, guys?
We just found out it's delayed 2 days.
Okay.
It's supposed to be out on February 15th. So we were having a big Valentine's push, but didn't turn out that way. But it's coming out in about 2.5 weeks. 2.5 weeks. And where? But today you can go right on Amazon and be guaranteed of a lower price if you pre-order it. It is available.
There's the pitch right there.
Exactly.
So where can people find out more about the book? Where can they go to find more about the book?
Well, we do have a website. If you remember our names, it's pretty easy because the website is desbergdavis.com.
Okay, sounds good. And I'll put that in the show notes so people can link over to it. Again, the book is Pitch Like Hollywood, What You Can Learn from the High Stakes Film Industry. And guys, Peter and Jeffrey, it's really been great to meet you, to hear about your stories, to read this book and learn a little bit more about the idea of pitching. So thank you for being on the show and sharing all of these thoughts and ideas.
Well, thank you for making this so easy and so much fun. You are very, very good at your job. I looked at the clock and said, wait, where did that go?
Yes, I know, but that's okay. It was really good stuff. And we went a little over time, but that happens. And I really appreciate you guys being on the show and sharing all this knowledge.
I'm speaking to Jeffrey. We really enjoyed this a lot.
Thank you. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.